Seven Ages. In terms of the idea of this game, it's almost a grail to me. You know, cover all of human history in some detail, more than history of the world does. History of the world is completely unsatisfying to me. It's like playing Britannia or something like that in terms of giving me storyline. Yet, not to the level of detail that like a Europa Universalis does. I love Europa Universalis, don't get me wrong there, but I want something a little bit easier, a little bit lighter than that. Get more of the big picture and less on the details of, you know, running my economy and counting up how many points I have to build my colonies and this, that, and the other. This felt like it should be in that lane. Unfortunately, it is virtually unplayable solitaire for me. However, I'll note one thing that I never, almost never do anymore. I put the counter tray back in here with things mostly sorted because I think I'm going to get back to this fairly soon. God knows. I mean, you know, I've got 18 pages on my still to video list. I may even get back to it without videoing, and you may just not see me for a few weeks while I play this straight through, not worrying about covering the video aspects of it. Or maybe just video it with the big story and ignore the gameplay aspect, because it's the big story that excites me in this, and I would rather just give you little snapshots and maybe, you know, cover the game in one or two videos, without worrying too much about the mechanisms of the play itself. All right. If it were so why is it so terrible, Solitaire? It's so terrible mainly for two reasons. One is you have to be aware of so much game state, and there is very little support for that in the game itself. Very little support for maintaining that game state in your head. There's some little counter somewhere, and you're going to have to look up in the rules to see what that counter does. Great. But how are you supposed to remember when it takes effect each time that it takes effect? And unfortunately, the counters could do better with that. But no matter what it is, you basically have to know the entire game state and what it all means in the game at all times to even play correctly at some times. So for example, I quit. Now I almost never quit a game, but I quit after having found that there was a counter in play on one person that affected, on one person's card that affected 2-3 other players, and I had already cheated and they had taken turns when they shouldn't have been allowed to. And I've gone through issues in this game and in other games, but in this game in particular, that were just as bad and kept going. The problem that I got to, though, had to do with something to do with the end of the game structure for the game, which is another flaw to the game as a game. But I'll leave that alone because, you know, I can enjoy playing the game up until the very end and say, all right, it's not interesting anymore. It's using this stupid mechanism that just does not work for a game of this length. All right. But that game state knowledge and the requirement to know basically what every single little artifact counter in the game, every single leader in the game, does and affects, that's a requirement on every player, even in a multiplayer game. You basically have to know what the hell is going on with every piece. And there are a lot of pieces where you have to know this. Otherwise, you might take your turn illegally. Yeah. So what? Okay, maybe. In the solitaire game, there's also a bunch of interactive cards. Interactive cards cause problems for me. They make the game much more difficult because I know that I'm not getting the kind of experience that I would be getting out of an opposed game of it. this same issue comes up in games like some of the CDGs. Here I Stand, for example. But there are a limited number of them. In this case, every single card in the game basically has 3 components. It has an empire, which takes up 2/3 of the card, and is, you know, really not useful during the game unless you're starting a new empire. It's got a strip that tells you an artifact. To find out what that artifact does, you have to do a rule lookup. Also, sometimes to find out if you can play it or not. Many of the artifacts have an asterisk on them, which will tell you, hey, you got to do a lookup to see if you can play this, if it's just a standard artifact or if it's played a little differently. Some of them do not have that asterisk, but should. You may or may not be able to play it at different times than normal, but it doesn't give you any indication of that. That's just part of the shit work of the components in this game, which have their real problems and are a big part of the issue. Instead of looking it up in the rules, there are some player aids available which give you that information, but it's still a lookup you have to do off the board to see what the hell everything does and what it's about. All right, fine. How much worse than Age of Renaissance is this? It is worse because these things appear and disappear for you all over the place. That game state is changing continuously. Plus, the counters themselves, and this is one of the biggest issues, the leader counters, the artifact counters, don't give you an indication of when in the player turn they take effect. At least Age of Renaissance gives you a sequence of play that tells you this, this, and this might affect you at this point. This, and this might affect you at this point. That is the core of some of the problem, but some of these counters. So in Age of Renaissance, you're going to have these this information all kept kind of in one place. On the player sheet, the one piece of information, one place where all the information is kept as to who has what advances. And then you can look into the sequence of play and you can see which ones line up. That's about the limit of what I can handle in a game, opposed or otherwise, in terms of what abilities do I have. This takes it a step further. You don't have some single piece of some single place of information. Now, you could make a player aid that does this, that maps what advances that your empires have. Of course, these can disappear on you and change on you, versus the sequence of play. I don't have in the player aids that I have such a piece of useful information. All I have is some things that maybe make the lookups a little easier. I have a nice sequence of play for the battle round. There's no sequence of plays in the game, basically. There kind of is one on the board, but there isn't one in the rules. So, I suppose you could make something to make this a little easier to play. You still have the problem of everybody's got their own hand of cards. So now the third thing in the set of cards is your event. And the events don't clearly call themselves out as to when they can be played. Usually they can only be played in civilized actions, but some of them can be played at certain points in the turn, just at random, kind of. You know, I mean, each card has its own specifics. So, for example, let's see, Storms can be played immediately as a response to the Fires card. Alternatively, it can be played within the civilized action. You're used to seeing them during the civilized action, but there are a bunch of cards that can be played in one specific event, you know, to prevent something from happening, or whatever. So that's an additional layer of, you know, sort of game state in terms of your own hand, even if you're playing opposed, that you have to be aware of the particular time when you can play all these different cards, and you're very likely, if you're me, to forget all that stuff, even playing opposed. Playing solitaire, man, it's just hell. I can't think of a player aid that could help that. I can think of a player aid that would essentially track everybody who's affected by various events, not events, but various leaders and artifacts, and when those artifacts take effect. That could be tracked in a single sheet. Basically, you'd have something that indicates, very much like this, all the artifacts that you have, and not this one. I've got one here. Here's one that seems to have most of the artifacts. I don't know if these are all of them. Nah, between these two pages, it's all of them. Something that had all the names of them here, cross-referenced with, say, which empire has them. You have to, of course. How you track the empires becomes a pain in the ass. The most solid way to track them would probably be by the specific color that they are. But remember, empires get discarded and born at different times, so you'd be constantly erasing that. But on the other hand, you could do it by the name of the empire. That might be... There you'd have to write in the names for each one as you go. Something like that could help. You'd still have the lookup from that chart into these suckers. But at least between those two pieces of information, one more piece in there. In addition to the name, you'd want to indicate what phases that it affects. So between those two charts, you'd basically be able to look up into things. Now, the game has a big footprint. So the table that I have, which I consider fairly large, would require another table to be added to. You need really a decent-sized conference table, or whatever, in order to play this thing, because it takes up a good amount of size, and it takes up, in addition to that, space for everybody to have their, if you're playing it opposed, everybody's got to have a couple of these out, because basically they're going to need this, and they're going to need that chart that I talked about. They're going to need, likewise, a look up into when each of the leaders actually has effect, in terms of where in the player order they're going to have effect. We have our sequence of play, which is unfortunately not in the rules. The rules try not to give you everything. They don't want to use up paper or something to give you everything in form. They also try to make them as dense as possible, so that they're absolutely impossible to find things that you need in them, except for the lookup things. The lookup things you can find fairly easily, although there are some things that you think are lookups which are kind of buried in the rules. But anyway, you have your sequence of play here. They decided not to add that to the rules because, actually being able to just take the rules, read them, and understand what the game's about, that would hinder your experience of how frustrating this game could have been made. So they optimized that whole, let's make this game the most fucking frustrating experience that we can make, by not providing you with the player aids that you need to play it effectively, make the rules kind of ambiguous at times, and make sure we hide things in the rules so that they're hard to find. They did fail in some cases, though. They made this useful lookup tables of the terms of play, for example, which you actually need defined for you. But of all the artifacts, they could have buried them in random places. They could have put them, say, in the designer's notes. Maybe every third word would be part of... I mean, they could have done things worse. But they definitely tried here to make this one of the least understandable and accessible games for what it is. Now, the rules themselves are hellish, and I've implied that already in here. There's no numbers. that are useful, so you can't have any kind of references into the rules. So basically you have to memorize the entire rule book so that you know what to find where. Now luckily for you, they're kind of short and densely written, which means that there aren't a lot of pages to flip through, but there's also not a whole hell of a lot of differentiation between what there is. There are also ambiguities in there. For example, who's in what age, at what, for what actions is a good question. I think I figured it out, which is to say that the only time that your actual age of your empire matters is for these, the artifacts, and for what things you can produce. Otherwise, the age that your empire is in, well, is the age that the game is in. There may be other places where it actually specifically calls that out. But what the rules don't do is really delineate between those two concepts, the age that your empire actually is in terms of progress and the age that the game is in. I don't feel like those are called out well enough. Something should specify the thing that I had to find through trial and error and then some reasoning after a playing. Basically, the first time you're going to be playing this, you're going to be trying to work out some of these things. There's kind of the weird idea that everybody has each color has its own little vagaries to it. This gives you this kind of false choice at the beginning of the game as to what color you want to be. It's false because you probably have absolutely nothing to base your decision on. Maybe you end up after a few playings liking a particular color, but this is not a game where your initial hand of cards is going to influence you too much. Basically, if you start in whatever age you end up starting in, which you may not know at the beginning of when you're making this decision, that age is the only one that really matters. The cards that you have that are in that age are the only ones that really affect whether or not you should pick a given color. Then there's this kind of weird outlier, this black counter set. If you're playing in 7 players, only one person gets to run 3 empires. And that means they are the ones who grab this extra counter set. That's kind of an issue. Because the one person who has that extra empire has what may seem like something of an advantage. Although the desire to maintain that advantage may actually kind of counterweigh it enough that it's not terribly effective. That doesn't bother me too much in the actual play of the game, but it does kind of give me this, somebody's got something weird here. The truth is that the person who has that third empire can probably hold on to it for the rest of the game. We certainly saw that in my game. Once they pick up a third empire, it's going to be really hard to take it away from them involuntarily. You have to actually target that particular empire and stomp it out. I would much rather see something where, oh hey, you might lose one of your primary colors if you have that third empire. Because this is a nice counter set in terms of some powerful pieces, but it's kind of small. So you wouldn't want that to happen. And you might want to discard this empire just so you could hold one of your counter sets. That's not how the game works, though. The way the game works is, if somebody stomps out one of your original colors, you still got it. And you get to hold on to this sucker to boot. I think that would be an interesting modification, to allow the person who holds the excess color set to actually lose one of their starting color sets, and someone else could pick that up. That would make the game much more dynamic and flexible in terms of who has the 3 colors and who doesn't. All right. One of the reasons that you might want to play this game rather than, say, History of the World, one is for the detail, and it definitely gives more detail. But one is because this one kind of holds you more aligned to history. However, it fails in a couple of ways. One way is that if you don't start in the First Era, and I can't speak to whether or not the First Era fixes this, but it's listed as the more historical option. If you don't start in the First Era, you have this kind of weird ramp up that makes you feel like you don't really have the established religions that you should, the established government types that you should earlier on. That's disturbing. It's disturbing because the spread of religion ends up kind of screwed up. If you don't have, say, the Romans spreading Christianity, Christianity doesn't become available, at least the way I play it, under sort of the normal pattern. You're not going to see Christianity spread to the British Isles easily, for example. However, I'm not certain, that's an ambiguous rule, that I'm doing it the way it's intended. It might be that you're only supposed to take a religion if you meet its full criteria. That the religions don't spread as easily as I played that they did. If that's the case, you will have a completely ahistorical game. If you allow the spread the way I do, you will also end up with an ahistorical game, I think, at least if I'm correct in my understanding of the value of Islam. Because Islam essentially generates far more points than any other religion by its ability to take territory and get points from that. Christianity does not have a way to generate glory. Confucianism, Buddhism, Hinduism, these do not give you a way to generate glory points in the same way that Islam does. Which makes Islam incredibly attractive. Glory is how you win the game. It's what your goal is. You know, you're constantly trying to get your glory up. The player who did the worst in the game that I played is someone who never had an Islamic country. I think everyone else had one. I think everyone else was able to get those points off of conquering things. The person who had the most didn't necessarily win. There comes a point when everything is Islam, so you no longer want to attack, because Islam is a religion of peace, of course, at least towards other Islam. That's not true either, but there might be a certain abstraction, though, to how what the religions mean. Which is to say that it may be the case that, for example, Ireland, who really desires to be Christian, never historically became Christian until, maybe, I don't know, when they broke free of England. I have no idea. Until the modern era, in the 7th period. And they would be able to become Christian then because they're within range of Palestine. That kind of doesn't make sense to me. But it would keep religions like Buddhism or Hinduism from spreading. It would keep a religion like Islam from being available to some people who it was. Islam did spread fairly deep into Africa earlier than it would probably be able to if you played that you had to be within range of Medina. So there is some question as to that. Would an early Ireland be considered Christian? In the sense that, sure, they were Christian historically, but they never really had the advantage that the Christians did in terms of expanding and proselytizing. So, except maybe kind of in England, but they could do that militarily. So I guess you could kind of call that a toss-up. Which way to interpret that is more historical. It's hard to tell. But certainly there comes a point in the game when I think Islam, in period 5 or whatever, is going to become so dominant anyway, because you have that range to Medina that you could probably arrange fairly easily. You'll also have weird battles, like in my game you had the Irish setting off into the Mediterranean to go become Christian. That had more to do, I think, with the lack of a Rome to spread Christianity than anything else. But if that's the case, then, well, you're still going to see that late in the game. You're going to see, the Tang on a quest to become Islamic, maybe fighting their way close enough to Medina that they can do so, and then being able to get points off the Islamic advantage. I don't think that's going to help the historical basis of the game to have people on quests for religions. I'm not sure. I don't think that actually reflects how religions, etc., progressed. So why the hell do I have this in this tray? Well, one, this is very much my kind of game if I could get a grasp on it. If I can get over the hump of being able to play it and memorize the things, if I could come up with a player aid that helps me keep track of the stuff, and I think I came up with one in my head just talking here, I feel like that's quite possible. I think that I can take a great deal of enjoyment out of it. I think if I'm not stopping and worrying about the damn camera, if I'm just playing it, and maybe coming back with some status reports as to, how the world's flowing. Although that wouldn't be terribly interesting on the camera, I think I could enjoy it. I also think that I can make some tweaks to how the religion, to how technology spreads. So here's one of the big ideas in the game, is this kind of progress of technology. You don't have this in History of the World. But in this, or it's completely abstracted and out of the system in that, hey, I'm a going empire, so I'm more dynamic and more able to take things, and that might include some technology. In this, you have real technology. And you have this track that largely keeps track of what technologies are available in terms of the weaponry, and to some extent certain advances, certain artifacts are aligned with it. Well, I would find it more interesting if those technologies, even just that linear value, was based a little bit more on geography and a little bit less on, hey, just take the leader's card and apply this setup value. So the Italians, no matter where the locus of advances are, if and when the Italians come into play, ages 4 on, they can start out exactly as high as the highest ranked person on the board is in terms of technology. So you could have a world where, and mine kind of was this way, where the Far East is ahead in technology, and then, what did we have? We had Portugal and Great Britain show up in the middle of these feudal societies as advanced as the Chinese were. How did that happen? Seriously. I mean, that didn't historically happen, right? The Italian Renaissance came because of contact with Islam, with the Arab states and the successors there. It came because there was human contact there. There was a range limitation on that. There are times when there are societies that become more dynamic. In a sense, that's reflected by, hey, what kind of hand of cards do you have? What kind of, civilization advances can you do? What kind of trade in progress do you do? Those mechanisms drive that perfectly fine. Of course, the danger there is the countries who most want to succeed at trade and progress, those are usually little African trading states, which I could very well see them becoming the leading states. You know, things like, I don't remember which one we had here. I think the Hausa were one of them. Things that just never really advanced very high. Those would be the states that, with the mechanisms in this game, would advance the most because they have the most, you know, advantage to do so. What you wouldn't see is any kind of promotion of, say, advances in the Far East or in Europe. So I feel like the problem here is these cards fail to drive the game the way they should. The empires that you'd want to be discovering things, to be dynamic, they don't have any reason to. All they have is this, hey, you blow up out of anywhere on the world, and look, you're really advanced compared to everything around you for no apparent reason. So I almost feel like the components would have to be completely reworked. In fact, I almost feel like these cards are a dead end because I don't feel like rewriting every single card. To some extent, I feel like you could kind of say, okay, let's take the advanced modifiers, and you have to be within range of those empires that you're getting the advance from, and then let's modify those a little bit, maybe make them a little bit more advantageous, cut the negative in half or whatever. But when I start speaking about that, I start realizing, well, you know, we're going to see the guys who have an advantage in trade in terms of getting glory points from it, who aren't necessarily terribly historically advanced societies, and who actually were societies which may have been good at trade but were really bad at being particularly cutting edge. Well, their cards would end up promoting them as more advanced. So what you have is kind of this fixed thing. Hey, you're Germany, great. You only have a -2. If China's big in the world, you magically become almost as good as they are in terms of technology. And that is very dissatisfying. So I almost feel like the game this hints at being could never be made from this game. That it points you in a direction and says, wow, there's something really cool that could be here. But the only thing in the game that works in terms of passing the ideas and new technologies on properly is religion and politics. And that, to tell you the truth, politics at least, once you flow into the right age just kind of magically, you can just create with no problem. Religion, for whatever reason, becomes absolutely centered, the question is for how long, on geography. Christ is going to show up in Palestine. Muhammad is going to show up at Medina. Buddha is going to show up in India. You know, these things just, Confucius is going to show up in China. And the Hindu are going to show up in India. And there's just no way of those religions starting somewhere else, which seems kind of weird given that other things are completely fluid. And then the spread may be a little too fluid as to how they go. So basically, this game almost tricks me into being impressed with it. And you might say, well, for something that's, you know, you're claiming is virtually unplayable, and I think it's virtually unplayable even in an opposed situation, because, at least for me, I cannot picture myself being able to remember the amount of game state necessary. It would require at least significant more support than the game itself provides. little bit about the components here. I've already talked about these counters. I find it a little disturbing that you're making this choice at the beginning of the game based on these counter mixes, and that it will affect you for the rest of the game. But it's kind of hard to know how it's going to affect you. It's not terrible, but somewhat disturbing. For example, in the game that I played, I lucked into the English getting the orange counter set because it's got lots of boats, you know? But I would have still chosen to take the English if only my yellow counter set was available, if luck had kind of put me into that position and I had the English in my hand. They're still a good choice. I just would have scored less points off of them based on that. And if I was some other color set, like I think the red-pink, well, the red had less boats. They couldn't ever score the top navy, and they couldn't prevent England from being the top navy. Now, here's another one in getting outside of the counters. The end of the game progress. It takes too damn long. There's too much, at least in the 7 players, where you have everybody, you know, cycling through the deck every turn because of the destiny action. It ends up having too much of a ha-ha, you didn't win this turn capability in people's hands. There's too much ability to stop people and let everybody else push up and get close. Now that's really, really cool in a shorter game. If this were a 3 or 4 hour game, I might not mind it. I certainly wouldn't mind it and don't mind it in, you know, a game of Hearts or a game of Illuminati where it's an hour or less. I think it's a really cool mechanism for that. In a game that runs, I don't know, it felt like it was going more than 12 hours to me. In a game of that extent, I don't feel like it's a very elegant mechanism. I feel like you kind of don't want that. The non-historical, i.e. normal, start. The game could start in period 7. It could be over almost immediately, conceivably. It really could. One person could start an empire, drop it on the board, be here, no one else is in period 7. They have the card that allows you to take another action, they do a civilized action, they put the internet up, and they win. It's over. Nobody got another chance to play because the cards didn't work well. That's the 7-minute version of the game, right? But I think that there's no real reason to play by the standard starting conditions. I thought, wow, there's this kind of cool mechanism where everybody's bidding for the start, you know, as to who gets to go. It's not that important. Other than the fact that somebody could win in 7 minutes, or that it allows you to kind of buffer your starting hand if you didn't get a turn 1 or turn 2. You know, if you didn't get an early start position, you put a big bid in and hope that you're able to force your will on the game. But it's a long enough game, and you get to discard your hand enough times that even if you don't start for a couple of turns for some reason, it's probably not that big a deal. We saw people who had tremendous leads get knocked way back. So there's a lot of room for catch-up here. If somebody jumps to an early lead, it's not that big a deal. But what is, to me, a big deal is that ending condition where I feel like the game ends up going several turns beyond where it should, simply because there are so many cards out there that can stop people. Now, that may be different if you play in 3. If you play in 3 players, there's not going to be that many of those cards out each turn. So, you know, chances are that the 2 people who are sitting on, you know, the losing positions don't have that card. On the other hand, the 6 people who are sitting on them in a 7-player game, it's almost assured that they're going to have them. And therefore, I would say that the end game conditions to this game are no fun. They're going to drag the game out a few extra turns if you're playing in a lot of players. I had really high hopes for this. I still kind of do. I still kind of feel like this is showing signs of being the game I really want. And in a sense, that's why my counters are out there. Why my counters are in a counter tray. Because I think maybe I can tweak this into something that I'll like. And like a lot. As it is, though, it's just so goddamn frustrating to actually play it that, I don't know. I see, and that frustration is in the core of the game, these damn cards. It feels like in order to make this something that I could like a lot, I would have to change nearly every card. Or get rid of them entirely. Just use them maybe for the empires. I don't know. No, you can't, because you've got the civilization on them and everything. I don't know. I really don't know. I don't think I'm ever going to get what I really want out of it, which involves technologies spreading. Rather than that linear tech chart. I want something that kind of has technologies and ideals spreading, and ideas in the basis of military and economic, etc. I like the fact that in this game you can do well with some empires without conquering big territories. That's not the only focus of the game. Some countries want to be high in tech. Some want to trade well. Some want to do this, that, and the other. In the end, the capability to end the game requires only that you be high tech. So yeah, there are some things really to love about this, and others that are just so painful or ahistorical or infuriating in various ways that it almost seems like, it's just too far from that enjoyable position for me to ever take pleasure. I don't know. In terms of playability, being able to get it to a playable section, I think it needs another end condition in it if you're going to be playing with a lot of players. I'm not sure what that end condition is, but something along the lines of, look, maybe people could discard cards towards pumping and ending. And once enough points are discarded in Era 7, you can call the game regardless of whether anybody can do anything else. And that would be kind of a process that if you're in the lead, you could just discard some cards you don't like and get maybe the value of them. Add this up, maybe say, hey, 25 points of this is added together and the game's over. It just doesn't matter. Just put a fixed time limit on it so that there's just no way that you can delay it. But there's another problem. The amount of trade in progress that's used, trade in progress is kind of an interesting factor. Because you want to pad your own points. And trade in progress tends, for most of the empires, to be something you don't terribly want to do. Especially when you're in the Dark Ages and you're not going to get a long string of advancements. It's just like, why bother? I'll just run up my score. And then I'll let somebody else do this work. I can always discard my old empire. It'll probably be pretty used up by that point, and put a new one in play, and now I'm in the running. And that's what we saw. The people who pushed the trade in progress didn't really do terribly well. But at some point or another, you have to push it, right? But if everybody decides they're not going to play it, the world just stays in stasis, and it can do that for a long, long time while people are trying to run up their scores. And that's kind of disappointing too. It just, to me, it feels like this game doesn't hang together very well. It doesn't motivate you in the right directions, and it doesn't do the right things. I don't know. I have to play it more, see if I can tinker with it, see if I can make something that works better. But as of right now, I feel like it has failed on nearly all counts for me. And I still rate it fairly reasonably because I think there's a brilliant idea behind this, but just not a satisfying game as it stands. Let's sum this up.